Hi, it's Katrina. My friend David is actually going to be helping me out today, so we can give you a little bit more variety. Everyone say hi!
Number 10. The Darkest Day. On May 19, 1780, the sun came up over the land of New England, and George Washington was in the middle of fighting the Revolutionary War. He wrote in his diary that the sun rose until early afternoon, and then everything went dark. For seemingly no reason, the sky blackened and everyone panicked. Thousands of terrified individuals abandoned their jobs, fled to churches, hid inside taverns, and prayed the world wasn't ending. The children were sent home from school, and cows were returned to their stalls. It was terrifying for everyone, even the animals. Most people in New England at the time thought it was Judgment Day. They believed the world was coming to an end, and that it was all starting with the death of the sun. Members of the legislature called the state council in Connecticut because they thought the day of judgment was upon them. There's even a painting that was made by De Las Palma called Dark Day, and it's still hung up in Stamford at the old town hall. The sun came up the next day, and the panic was averted, but for a few tense hours, it looked like the apocalypse had come. Modern scientists think the dark day was a combination of clouds, fog, and smoke. There was most likely a wildfire burning in Canada, which sent the smoke to block out the sun. And now for number 9. But first, it's shout-out time. I wanted to give a big thank you to Emily Annam and Demon Gaiman YT for supporting this channel. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos about amazing discoveries, or dinosaurs, or crazy events throughout history. Number 9. Dante and Virgil in Hell. Dante and the Virgil in Hell is an exceptionally grim painting that was done by William Adolphe Bouguereau in 1850, and it's currently on display in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. The painting was inspired by the Divine Comedy, written by Dante Alighieri in the early 14th century. Dante described a journey through hell, guided by Virgil down through the 9 circles of damnation, on their way to purgatory and later paradise. This painting shows Dante and Virgil in the 8th circle of hell with the forgers. The artwork depicts the pair as they watch Gianni Schicchi bite the heretic alchemist Capocchio on the neck. In the sky above the men is a demon with great red wings. Dante may not have believed the world was coming to an end, but he lived during the time of great religious turmoil, a time in which it seemed heretics and the apocalypse were on everyone's mind. The world, in his eyes, was going straight to hell. The first part of his epic poem is a long narrative of the many layers of hell and all those who reside there. He even included characters like Cleopatra in the realm of lust, and in the final pit of hell there was Judas stuck in the jaws of Lucifer, who's depicted as a 3-headed demon. Number 8. Martin Luther's Apocalypse. Martin Luther was the German priest responsible for creating the basis of Lutheranism. He became a priest in 1507 AD and soon came to hate the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church, and so he spoke out against their corruption. When Pope Leo X demanded that Martin Luther renounce his writings and take back his criticisms of the Church in 1520 AD, Martin Luther refused, and as a result he was excommunicated. Just like Dante, who lived in the early 1300s during the brutality of the Inquisition, Martin Luther lived during the Mohammedan threat. Many people believed the Church had become corrupted by Satan, and at the same time the Mohammedans, followers of Islam, had invaded Europe, and there was war at every turn. During Martin Luther's age, it was the general opinion that the world was coming to an end. In 1528 AD, Martin Luther estimated the world would end before he could finish his translation of the Old Testament. He believed so wholeheartedly in the apocalypse that he started his translation with the book of Daniel. That's the biblical apocalypse from the Old Testament, written in the 2nd century BC. The book of Daniel is all about Daniel's apocalyptic vision, filled with beasts, lions, and the devil, and the prophecy of the prince who is to come. Martin Luther thought the apocalypse was so close that he wanted to translate the biblical apocalypse so that people knew what to expect in their final days. Number 7. The Last Day of Pompeii. In the early days of Christianity, Pompeii was decimated by a volcanic eruption. In 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius erupted and blanketed the nearby Roman cities in hot ash. People burned to death, and some even suffocated on the volcanic discharge. There were also individuals that were so close to the volcano when it erupted that they likely burst into flames. If you lived in Rome during the 1st century AD when this happened, you might have thought the world was coming to an end. It's very likely that the eruption was powerful enough to black out the sun and to fill the sky with fire, keeping people away from the mountain for decades. In the Russian Museum in St. Petersburg is a fantastic piece of art that shows the final moments before the volcano destroyed the city. It's called The Last Day of Pompeii, the most famous work of Karl Brylov. It took him 6 years to complete his masterpiece, which was finished in 1833. Years before he began, Karl visited the early excavations of Pompeii while on a trip to Naples. Looking at the devastation with his own eyes, Karl got an idea to create a massive canvas and dedicate it to the destruction of the city. The idea for the painting came to him in 1827. He then drew some sketches, but the very final version on the large canvas took 3 years to complete. The painting brought Karl an unimaginable amount of fame, and for good reason. It shows Pompeii in chaos, with Romans adorned in colorful togos hiding from the fires of hell as the volcano blows its top in the distance. No other famous painting of Pompeii gives off the horror of the event with such humanity as this one. Number 6. Johannes Stefler. Johannes Stefler was a German mathematician and astronomer in the early 15th century. He was born in 1452, and throughout his life, he made great headway in the field of astronomy. He even went as far as to create his own instruments. For a while, he taught as a professor at the University of Tübingen, and if the legend is to be believed, he inspired panic in his old age when he predicted that a global flood would decimate the world. From what we know about Johannes, he was a doomer. He believed the world would come to a screeching halt at any moment, and it would be terrible. On February 20th, 1524, a light drizzle began to fall. Johannes had already predicted the world would be engulfed by a flood, and his prediction had been enough to inspire people to build their own ark. A massive 3-story ark had just been completed and was floating on the Rhine River when the rain began to fall. Word started to spread that the rain would never stop and that the world would be flooded, and soon enough people were fighting each other like savages to get a place on the ark. There are no official numbers, but it's been said more people died trying to get on the ark than in the rain because the flood never came. It was just an unusually heavy rainstorm. In the aftermath, Johannes was undeterred by the failed apocalypse. He simply said the flood was definitely coming and that it would likely happen within the next 30 years. Shortly after, in 1530, Johannes contracted the plague and died. Number 5. The Mystical Nativity. Alessandro da Mariano de Vanni Filippi, or Sandro Botticelli as he was better known, was a master artist of the Italian Renaissance. One of his most amazing creations was the Mystical Nativity, completed in 1500 AD. The young prodigy had apprenticed as a goldsmith as a teenager and was later apprenticed by an Italian painter named Fra Filippo Lippi. But by 1470 AD, the student had become the master and opened his very own shop. It's believed one of Botticelli's greatest influences was the Italian Dominican preacher Girolamo Savonarola. Savonarola arrived in Florence and took control following the upheaval of the Medicis in 1494 AD. He wanted to change the religious landscape and planned to burn everything he associated with moral weakness, and that included a lot of the Florentine artwork. You could think of him as an extremist. We know Botticelli listened to Savonarola's preaching, but it's unclear how much he took to heart. There was a heavy belief in those days, like in all the days since the idea appeared, that the apocalypse was coming because the world was entrenched in sin. In 1497 AD, Savonarola had become too much for the rest of the church. He was excommunicated by Pope Alexander VI, and afterward he was hung and burned. It's believed the events of Savonarola's life had a huge influence on the mystical nativity. The painting shows a basic view of the nativity scene, including Mary, Jesus, and the angels. But the painting is full of unusual details and hidden symbolism as well. At the top of the painting is a circle of angels pulling people away from the demons at the bottom who attempt flight into the underworld. It's supposed to be a visual representation of good's triumph over evil. Has there ever been a time in your life that you wholeheartedly believed the world was coming to an end? Tell us about it in the comments down below. And while you're at it, subscribe! Number 4. The Fifth Crusade. The Fifth Crusade was, like all the other crusades, all about recapturing Jerusalem from the Muslims. When Pope Innocent III began to organize the crusade in the early 13th century AD, he used apocalyptic theology to rally the people of Europe. He preached all about the end of the world and the rise of the Antichrist. Pope Innocent made it very clear that if the forces of Islam weren't removed from the Holy Land, the end of days would be upon everyone. The Pope claimed that Islam itself was the Antichrist in full control of Jerusalem. Only the defeat of the Antichrist would bring about the second coming of Jesus Christ. But the apocalypse didn't come, and the Fourth Crusade was a disaster. However, the fundraising campaign went very well, and the church made a lot of money. They also convinced a massive number of Europeans to fight on behalf of the church to prevent the triumph of the Antichrist. But instead of attacking Jerusalem directly, they chose to attack cities controlled by Muslims in North Africa, especially Egypt. The Pope figured Egypt would be easier to beat than Jerusalem, and that was a major mistake. In the end, the crusade failed epically, leaving 20,000 people dead. The Crusaders were ultimately defeated in humiliating combat on the banks of the Nile. Number 3. The King's Eclipse. On August 2nd, 1133 AD, a solar eclipse occurred over England. When most eclipses happen, the moon completely covers the sun for 2.5 minutes. Humans have known about this for eons because they've seen it and recorded it. But on this day in August, the solar eclipse lasted nearly twice as long. It went on for long enough to inspire panic in the hearts of men as chaos erupted in England. To make matters even worse, the solar eclipse coincided perfectly with the departure of King Henry I of England to Normandy. It truly did seem as if the departure of King Henry caused the sun to turn black. The great historian William of Malmesbury wrote, "Hideous darkness agitated the hearts of men." After the eclipse, England was thrown into madness and civil war, and just a short while later, King Henry passed away. But the king didn't die because of the eclipse. He apparently died 4 years later because he'd fallen ill after eating too many eels. Still, the eclipse is remembered all these years later as a bad omen for monarchs. It's almost always seen as a sign of impending doom, as either a warning for the end of the world or for the end of an age. Number 2. The Last Judgment. On the wall past the altar in the Sistine Chapel is one of Michelangelo's greatest works. The Last Judgment is the apocalyptic painting that displays the second coming of Christ. The Son of God is the central figure in the artwork, but Michelangelo did the whole thing a little differently. He wasn't the first to create a painting of the Last Judgment, but he went his own unique route by mixing images from the Bible with mythology. The painting depicts the end of existence, the day in which Christ rises again and God passes his judgment over all of humanity. There are over 300 figures in the painting, which originally were drawn naked by Michelangelo. But this was the 16th century AD, and when the painting was completed in 1541 AD, naked people just weren't acceptable. So Michelangelo's pupil, Daniele da Volterra, was subsequently hired to paint everyone with loincloths and veils. Michelangelo painted Christ surrounded by saints and martyrs, and even depicted the souls of the dead being resurrected from their graves and floating like ghosts to be judged. He drew hell in the bottom right corner, showing demons greedily grabbing what few souls they still can. The rest of the souls can be seen slipping upward from the ground, floating through the clouds as they make their way toward heaven. Even today, this is the general idea behind the apocalypse. Christ will come back, and all the souls of the righteous will be sucked up to an eternal afterlife in heaven, but everyone else is sent straight down to hell. Number 1. Ragnarok. Researchers from the University of Cambridge recently extracted ice core samples from Greenland. They then used the samples to confirm the date of the largest volcanic eruption to take place in Iceland in the last 2,000 years. Ice core samples prove the volcano erupted in 940 AD, only a few decades after Vikings showed up to settle the land. Shortly after the massive eruption, which would have created a literal flood of lava that nearly immersed the entire island, The Viking gods were allegedly killed. Scientists have speculated that the violence and supernatural power of the eruption was so terrible, Vikings believed some form of Ragnarok had occurred and their gods were dead. The eruption coincides almost perfectly with the sudden decline of Norse ideals and the sharp rise of Christianity. The volcanic eruption had frightful consequences for the people of Europe. Volcanologist Clive Oppenheimer says there were poor harvests, food shortages, and freezing cold summers following the cataclysmic event. There was also an atmospheric haze that caused the world to be darker and the winters to be far more severe. The eruption also coincided with a prophecy of the end of the gods. It must have seemed to the Vikings that their gods were annihilated. The Great Fire had come, the gods were all gone, and they were on the brink of freezing and starving to death as the world came to an end. So afterward, it made sense for them to turn to Christianity, forsaking the old ways forever and ushering in a new age of religion. What's your favorite apocalyptic piece of artwork? Let us know in the comments down below. And if you liked this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye guys!